He became the richest billionaire in America and invited his wife to humiliate her. But when she arrived, she destroyed his entire world. Hi, my beautiful family. Let's begin with a small prayer from my heart to yours. Dear Lord, as I take this step toward healing, walk beside me, guide every hand that cares for me, calm my spirit, and bring me back to my family stronger, healthier, and full of peace. Amen. This is your Mr. Peter speaking to the family I love so deeply. I'll be away for just 2 to 3 days, traveling to New York for a medical checkup. But don't worry, I'll be back in 3 days by God's grace, smiling and ready to pour my soul into every word for you again. I know some of you may feel a little disappointed not hearing my voice today. I understand that truly, but please, my beautiful family, don't leave the story just because of this long message. It's a humble request. Many of our new beautiful family members sometimes skip or leave when they see the introduction. You can skip the intro if you wish, but stay for the story. And if something in the story touches your heart, you're always welcome to share your thoughts in the comments. I read them with love. While I'm away, James will be here to hold your hand through every word. So let's stay close, stay connected. And now, with all my love, let's begin today's story together.
The most dangerous moment in a woman's life is when she believes she's finally safe. Alyssa Robinson pressed her hand against her swollen belly, remembering when Dan used to talk to their unborn baby every night, his hand warm on her stomach as he whispered about teaching him to play baseball or her to paint watercolors like her mother used to do. That Dan, the gentle man who'd courted her with handwritten letters and surprise picnics in Central Park, had died somewhere along the road to $30 billion. She just hadn't realized she was married to his ghost. Mrs. Robinson? Dr. Patricia Hayes frowned at the test results, her expression growing serious. Your blood pressure is dangerously elevated and combined with yesterday's bleeding episode. I'm admitting you for observation. This level of stress could trigger premature labor. Alyssa's hand instinctively moved to her belly. Admit me, but I feel fine now. Alyssa, you're exhibiting classic signs of severe psychological trauma. Has something happened at home? Any conflict with your husband? Before Alyssa could answer, her phone buzzed. Dan, finally returning her 17 missed calls. She stepped into the hospital corridor, clinging to hope that the man she'd married was still somewhere inside the billionaire he'd become. Jesus Christ, Alyssa, what now? His voice was ice-cold, irritated. I'm about to close the Morrison deal, $20 billion, and you're calling with another emergency. Dan, I'm at the hospital. I'm bleeding, and Dr. Hayes thinks... Bleeding? Again? You've been to the doctor 3 times this month with your dramatics. The casual cruelty in his voice made her legs weak. When had her husband started talking to her like she was an annoying employee? This isn't dramatics. Something's wrong with the baby. There's nothing wrong except your constant need for attention. Handle whatever this is yourself. I'm not leaving a $1 billion negotiation because you're having anxiety attacks. Dan, please, I'm scared. The baby will be fine, Alyssa. You're just being hysterical like you always are when you want to disrupt my work. The line went dead, leaving Alyssa staring at her phone in the sterile hospital hallway, finally understanding that she was completely alone in this pregnancy. She drove home in a daze, every traffic light feeling like an eternity, her mind replaying 7 years of marriage and wondering when exactly her husband had stopped loving her. Was it when his first $1 billion made him believe he was untouchable? When Forbes put him on their cover? When powerful people started treating him like a god? When she finally reached their Park Avenue penthouse, 15,000 square feet of marble and crystal that had never felt like home, she could hear laughter echoing from the living room. Dan's voice and a woman's. Alyssa's heart stopped, She pushed open the door to find Dan on their white leather sofa, his arm around a stunning blonde who couldn't be older than 25. The woman was wearing Alyssa's favorite red dress, the one Dan had bought her for their 5th anniversary, the one she'd worn to the charity gala where he'd told everyone how lucky he was to have such a supportive wife. "Oh," the blonde said, not looking embarrassed in the slightest. "The wife's home." Dan didn't even have the decency to move his arm or look guilty. He looked annoyed, as if Alyssa had interrupted something important. "Alyssa, we need to talk." We need to talk." Alyssa's voice barely worked. "Dan, what is this?" "This," he gestured between himself and the woman with casual indifference, "is what happens when a man outgrows his first choice." The blonde laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Oh, honey, you think this just started? Dan and I have been together for 2 years, ever since I got hired as his executive assistant. 2 years, while Alyssa had been trying to get pregnant, celebrating their anniversaries, defending Dan to her friends who said he was changing. 2 years of lies, deception, and humiliation. Did you really think," Dan stood up, straightening his $5,000 tie with the casual arrogance of a man who'd never faced consequences, "that I married you for love?" The question hit Alyssa like a physical blow. "My grandfather's will required me to have a respectable wife to inherit the Robinson fortune. You were convenient, sweet, naive, grateful for any attention from a man like me. But our baby is a complication I didn't plan for." Dan's voice was winter cold. "I told you to be more careful. I told you I wasn't ready for children." The woman, Kinsley, Alyssa suddenly remembered from office Christmas parties, rose gracefully, still wearing Alyssa's dress like a trophy. "The truth is, darling," Kinsley's voice dripped with false sympathy, "Dan never wanted to be tied down to someone like you. I mean, look at you." Her eyes traveled dismissively over Alyssa's pregnant form. "You're not exactly Park Avenue material, are you? More like Queens." "Kinsley's right," Dan said, and the casual agreement was somehow worse than active cruelty. "You were fine when I was building my empire, but now that I'm at the top, I need a woman who can match my status, someone who understands power." Alyssa felt the baby kick hard, as if responding to her racing heartbeat, her spiking blood pressure, her body's fight-or-flight response to psychological trauma. "You're telling me this while I'm 7 months pregnant with your child?" "About that?" Dan reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope, extending it toward her with the same casual indifference he'd show a waiter presenting a check. "Divorce papers, already filed. I've been generous. You get the apartment in Queens and $50,000. That's more than someone like you deserves." "Someone like me?" Alyssa whispered, the words barely audible. "Let's be honest, Alyssa. You're a secretary from Brooklyn who got lucky. I'm Daniel Robinson. My family built half of Manhattan. Did you really think this was forever?" Kinsley moved to Dan's side, fitting perfectly against him like she belonged there, like she'd been there all along. "The thing is, sweetie," Kinsley continued with practiced cruelty, "Dan told me all about your little episodes. The crying, the neediness, the way you cling to him at social events because you don't know how to talk to important people. That's not—" "And now," Dan interrupted, his voice carrying the cold finality of a business decision, "you're trying to trap me with a baby. Well, here's some free advice from someone who understands how the real world works. Cut your losses." "Cut my losses?" Alyssa could barely breathe. "Get rid of it," Dan said flatly, the words hitting Alyssa like physical blows. "The pregnancy. It's still early enough for medical intervention, and honestly, it would save us all a lot of trouble." The room spun. Her husband, the man who'd once cried when she'd had a miscarriage 3 years earlier, was telling her to abort their baby like it was a business problem to be solved. You want me to... Our baby. I want you to be practical. What kind of life could you give a child? You'll be a single mother working minimum wage jobs. I'll fight for custody and win because I can afford better lawyers. Do you really want to put a child through that? Kinsley examined her manicured nails with bored interest. Plus, honey, let's be real. Dan doesn't want damaged goods. A baby would just remind him of his mistake. His mistake? Alyssa looked at the man she'd loved for 7 years, searching for any trace of the person who used to bring her coffee in bed, who used to call her his beautiful girl, who used to trace her face with his fingertips and tell her she was the best thing that had ever happened to him. You, Dan said simply, brutally. You were the mistake. I was young, stupid, thought I needed someone sweet and simple, but I've evolved. Men like me don't stay with women like you. Suddenly, Alyssa felt a sharp pain knife through her abdomen. She gasped, doubling over, one hand clutching her belly, the other reaching for the wall to steady herself. Oh, please, Kinsley rolled her eyes with theatrical disgust. More drama. Alyssa, Dan's voice held no concern, only irritation. Don't start with the theatrics. I'm not. Another wave of pain crashed through her, sharper this time, accompanied by a wetness that made her blood freeze. Something's wrong with the baby. She looked up at Dan, begging with her eyes for the man she married to appear, to remember that she was carrying his child, to feel something, anything human. Instead, he checked his Rolex. I have a dinner meeting with Japanese investors, he said matter-of-factly. Kinsley, are you ready? Dan, Alyssa whispered, pain radiating through her body. I need to get to the hospital. So go. You drove yourself here, didn't you? But what if what, Alyssa? What if something happens? What if you lose the baby? Dan shrugged with chilling indifference. Like I said, it might save us all some trouble. Kinsley laughed, actually laughed, at his wife's medical emergency. Oh, Dan, you're terrible. I love it. They walked past Alyssa toward the door, stepping around her crumpled form like she was an inconvenient piece of furniture. Dan paused for a moment, looking down at his wife, his pregnant wife who was clearly in distress, and Alyssa held her breath, hoping for mercy, for love, for anything human. By the way, he said conversationally, I've frozen all the joint accounts. You have until tomorrow morning to pack your things and get out. Security will escort you if necessary. Dan, please. It's Mr. Robinson to you now. You're no longer family. The door closed behind them with a final, echoing click that sounded like a coffin lid slamming shut. Alyssa stood alone in the penthouse that had been her home for 7 years, one hand pressed against her belly where their child was fighting to survive, the other clutching divorce papers that reduced 7 years of her life to $50,000, and a queen's apartment she'd never seen. Outside, rain began to fall against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse that would never feel like home again. Alyssa realized she was completely alone in a 5,000-square-foot monument to a love that had never really existed. The man she'd loved, the man whose child she carried, had just told her he hoped their baby would die, and felt no shame about it. That was the moment Alyssa Robinson learned what real hatred felt like, pure and cold and clarifying. That was also the moment she realized that Daniel Robinson had made the worst mistake of his life, because he'd just declared war on a woman who had nothing left to lose and a child's life to fight for. She didn't know how yet, but somehow, someday, he would pay for every cruel word, every heartless moment, every prayer that their innocent baby wouldn't survive. She just had to make sure she and her baby survived first. And then, the real work could begin. Chapter 2. The Disappeared Queen. They say the dead can't hurt you, but they never met a woman who'd been buried alive by the man she loved. 5 years later, Daniel Robinson stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office on the 52nd floor, surveying Manhattan like the emperor he believed himself to be. Forbes had just named him America's richest man, worth $38 billion, and the Wall Street Journal crowned him the most feared dealmaker in corporate America. What Dan didn't know was that his meteoric rise had been carefully orchestrated by a ghost. Every competitor who'd mysteriously collapsed, every deal that had fallen perfectly into his lap, every lucky break that had catapulted him to the top, all of it had been the work of A.T. Turner, the phantom mogul who'd been reshaping American business from the shadows. Dan assumed he was just that brilliant. He was catastrophically wrong. "Mr. Robinson," his assistant's voice interrupted his self-congratulation. "Your mother is on line 1. She sounds distressed." Dan sighed, recognizing the monthly ritual of guilt and grief. "Put her through." "Danny." Eleanor Robinson's voice carried the weight of 5 years of manufactured mourning. "I went to the cemetery today, to where we buried the empty coffin." Dan's jaw tightened. The funeral had been his masterpiece of deception, a closed casket service for his supposedly deceased wife and stillborn child. He'd even hired actors to play grief-stricken hospital staff who'd tried everything to save them. "Mother, we've discussed this. You need to let them rest in peace." "But I keep having dreams, Danny. Alyssa is calling for help, and there's a little boy with her. He looks just like you did at that age. Dreams aren't reality, they're dead. Both of them." "Are you sure?" Eleanor's voice cracked. "Because I hired a private investigator, Danny. There are no medical records of Alyssa dying in childbirth. No records of a baby being stillborn. The hospital you claimed she died at has no record of her ever being admitted." Dan's blood turned to ice. "Mother, you need to stop this obsession. I know you're lying to me. What I don't know is why. What really happened to Alyssa and your child?" Dan hung up, but Eleanor's words echoed in his mind. No medical records, no hospital admission. After 5 years, his mother had finally started digging. He pushed the thought away and returned to his real obsession, a T. Turner. For 3 years, Turner Global had been the invisible hand guiding American business. The company appeared overnight and grew with supernatural speed, now worth $18 billion and climbing. More mysteriously, A.T. Turner's business strategy seemed designed specifically to benefit Robinson Industries. Whenever Dan needed a competitor eliminated, Turner Global would acquire them and strip their most valuable assets, leaving them defenseless against Dan's hostile takeovers. When Dan needed government contracts, Turner Global would mysteriously discover irregularities in rival bids, clearing Dan's path to victory. It was as if someone was systematically clearing obstacles from his path to absolute dominance. But why? Dan opened his secure files on Turner Global. 3 years of investigation that had yielded almost nothing. The company was a maze of shell corporations and international holdings. A T. Turner had never appeared publicly, never given interviews, never left a digital fingerprint. But there were patterns, disturbing patterns. Turner Global's first acquisition, Brooklyn Methodist Hospital, the same hospital where Alyssa had volunteered during their marriage. Second acquisition, New Beginnings Legal Aid, specializing in domestic violence cases. Third, the Emma Goldman Scholarship Fund for single mothers pursuing graduate degrees. Every early investment was connected to women, children, or healthcare. Every acquisition felt personal. Dan's hands trembled as he opened a new search. A. Turner Stanford Business School 2020. The results made his world tilt off its axis. Local woman overcomes tragedy to excel at Stanford. New York Times, September 2020. A. Turner, whose identity is being protected for privacy reasons, is a single mother whose husband abandoned her during pregnancy. Despite facing homelessness and medical complications during childbirth, Turner has excelled in Stanford's MBA program and been offered positions at several major consulting firms. "I want to build something that protects other women from what I went through," Turner said in a rare interview. "Men who think they can discard women and children like garbage need to learn that we're stronger than they imagine." The article was accompanied by a silhouetted photo, a woman in graduation robes holding a small child's hand. The shadows obscured their faces, but something about the woman's posture was achingly familiar. Dan's laptop slipped from his numb fingers. A Turner, Stanford MBA, single mother abandoned during pregnancy, timing that perfectly matched Alyssa's disappearance. With shaking hands, Dan pulled up Turner Global's complete acquisition history. What he found was a masterpiece of strategic revenge disguised as business brilliance. Year 1. Turner Global acquired failing companies in healthcare, legal aid, and social services, building a network of support systems for abandoned women and children. Year 2. They began targeting companies that competed directly with Robinson Industries, but instead of destroying them, Turner Global would strip away their most valuable assets and then mysteriously go bankrupt, leaving those assets available for Dan to acquire at pennies on the dollar. Year 3. Turner Global pivoted to major acquisitions, but every single purchase somehow benefited Robinson Industries. Competitors would find themselves financially weakened, just as Dan needed to expand into their markets. It wasn't random. It wasn't lucky. It was the most sophisticated long-term business strategy Dan had ever seen, orchestrated by someone who understood his weaknesses, his desires, his business patterns better than he understood them himself. Someone who'd lived with him for 7 years, someone who'd watched him build his empire from their shared bed, who'd heard his strategies during pillow talk, who knew exactly which competitors he feared most. Someone who'd been declared legally dead 5 years ago. Dan's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Enjoying your rise to the top, Dan? You should thank your guardian angel. A friend." His hands shaking, Dan typed back, "Who is this?" The response came immediately. "Someone who's been watching you succeed for 5 years. Someone who's been very, very patient. What do you want?" "I want you to remember something, Dan. Remember the night you told a bleeding pregnant woman that you hoped she'd lose her baby. Remember throwing her out in the rain while she begged for help?" Dan's vision blurred. "You're dead. I know you're dead." Dead women don't build $18 billion companies, Dan. Dead women don't manipulate stock markets and orchestrate hostile takeovers. Dead women don't spend 5 years positioning their enemies for the perfect fall. But brilliant women who've been underestimated their entire lives, women who've been thrown away like garbage by men who thought they were worthless, women who've had 5 years to study, plan, and prepare. Those women can do anything. Dan's phone rang. Unknown number. With trembling fingers, he answered. "Hello, Dan." The voice was older, more confident, but unmistakably hers. Unmistakably Alyssa. "I've missed our talks," she continued conversationally. 5 years is a long time to go without speaking to your husband. You're really alive." Disappointed? Dan couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. "I suppose you're wondering about our son." David. "He's 5 now. Brilliant, kind, everything you said he'd never be. He's sitting next to me right now, actually. Would you like to say hello to your son, Dan?" "Mommy, who are you talking to?" A child's voice, innocent and sweet, came through the phone. "Just someone from Mommy's past, sweetheart. Someone who's about to learn that the past has a way of catching up." "You built Turner Global," Dan whispered. "I built an empire, Dan. While you thought I was rotting in some unmarked grave, I was learning everything you never bothered to teach me about business, power, and revenge. I became everything you said I was too stupid and weak to be. But why help my competitors fail? Why clear my path to—" Alyssa's laugh was crystalline and cold. "Oh, Dan, sweet, arrogant Dan, I didn't help you succeed. I positioned you at the very top of the mountain so the whole world could watch you fall." The line went dead, leaving Dan alone with the devastating realization that his supposedly dead wife had spent 5 years becoming more powerful than he'd ever dreamed possible. And tomorrow, the woman he'd thrown away like garbage would begin his destruction. The ghost was about to become very, very real. Chapter 3. The Wedding Invitation. The most beautiful revenge is the one your enemy never sees coming until it's already destroyed everything they love. Alyssa Turner stood in her glass-walled office on the 40th floor of Turner Tower, watching the sun set over Manhattan while her 5-year-old son, David, colored dinosaur pictures at the small table she'd installed for their after-school time together. Her building was strategically positioned just 12 blocks from Robinson Industries, close enough to watch Dan's empire in real time, far enough to remain invisible. For 5 years, she had been the phantom reshaping American business, while raising the son Dan had told her to get rid of. Today, that phantom would step into the light and end Daniel Robinson forever. "Mommy." David looked up from his coloring book with the serious expression that made him seem older than his years. "Why are you smiling like the dinosaur who found the biggest fish?" Alyssa knelt beside her son, studying the face that was heartbreakingly beautiful. Dan's strong jawline softened by her gentle eyes, Dan's dark hair with her natural curl. David was everything Dan had tried to destroy, and he had grown into the most remarkable little boy she'd ever known. "Because today, sweetheart, we're going to show the world who we really are." David nodded solemnly. At 5, he possessed an unusual wisdom, born from spending his early years in boardrooms and business meetings. He knew his mother was important, powerful, but he didn't know why they lived under assumed names or why he'd never met his biological father. Soon, the whole world would understand everything. Alyssa's assistant, Brinley Hamilton, entered with a stack of newspapers and a tablet displaying social media feeds. "It's official. Page 1 of every paper, trending on every platform." The headline of the New York Times made Alyssa's heart sing. "Daniel Robinson to marry Kinsley Whitmore in $50 million wedding extravaganza, the social event of the decade." The article gushed about the guest list, 500 of America's most powerful people, including senators, Supreme Court justices, Fortune 500 CEOs, and European royalty. The ceremony would be held at Dan Hampton's estate, with flowers flown in from Holland, champagne from the private cellars of French nobility, and a wedding cake that cost more than most people's houses. It was going to be the ultimate display of wealth, power, and social dominance. It was also going to be Daniel Robinson's public execution. "And the special delivery?" Alyssa asked. Brinley's smile was razor-sharp. "Arrived at his office 20 minutes ago." Across town, Dan Robinson was experiencing the first crack in his perfect facade. The anonymous package had been hand-delivered by a courier who disappeared before security could question him. Inside was a single USB drive and a note written in elegant script. "A wedding gift for the happy couple. Enjoy your special day. A friend." Dan's hands trembled as he inserted the drive into his computer. The video file that opened would haunt him forever. It was Kinsley in their bed, with 3 different men over the past month. The footage was professional quality, shot from multiple angles with crystal-clear audio. But the most devastating part wasn't Kinsley's athletic infidelity. It was her words. "Dan's such a pathetic fool," she laughed to one lover, a man Dan recognized as his own business rival. "He actually thinks I love him. This is all about the money, obviously. Once I'm Mrs. Robinson, I'll take half of everything and disappear." "What about his first wife?" the man asked, lighting a cigarette in Dan's own bedroom. "The dead one?" "Please. He told me he threw her out while she was pregnant and hoped she'd die in childbirth. Can you imagine being married to such a monster? I'm doing the world a favor by bleeding him dry before someone else has to deal with him." Dan's vision blurred as the video continued, showing Kinsley with his lawyer, his accountant, even his personal trainer, all of them laughing about his naivety, his desperation to be loved, his willingness to believe that a 25-year-old model could genuinely care for a man 30 years her senior. The final clip was the worst. Kinsley on the phone with someone discussing exit strategies and asset protection while lounging in the bathtub Dan had had custom installed for her birthday. The prenup is ironclad, but there are ways around it. Emotional abuse, isolation tactics, maybe even claims about threats. Rich men always have dirty secrets. I just need to document enough to make divorce court profitable. The video ended with a text overlay. Some women marry for love, others marry for revenge. Which kind do you think you chose? Your guardian angel. Dan stared at the black screen, his $50 million wedding, scheduled for tomorrow, crumbling around him as he realized his fiancée was a professional con artist who'd been documenting his behavior for months. But the real nightmare was just beginning. Within hours, Dan's office was swarming with reporters who'd somehow obtained copies of the video. They shouted questions that made his blood run cold. "Mr. Robinson, is it true you told your pregnant wife you hoped she would die? Can you comment on the rumors that you've been under federal investigation? What's your response to allegations of domestic violence during your first marriage?" No comment, Dan repeated like a broken record, but the damage was spreading like wildfire across social media. Someone had leaked not just the video, but documentation of his first marriage that painted him as a monster. Hospital records showing Alyssa's injuries, security footage of Dan having her escorted from their home while she was bleeding, financial records proving he'd frozen her accounts while she was in emergency surgery. His phone buzzed with cancellations that felt like physical blows. The florist. "Mr. Robinson, I'm terribly sorry, but there's been a fire at our facility. Your $200,000 flower arrangements are gone." The caterer. "Sir, our entire staff has come down with food poisoning. We can't possibly serve 500 guests tomorrow." The string quartet. "Mr. Robinson, we've received some disturbing information about your character. We can't in good conscience perform at your wedding." One by one, every vendor canceled. The photographer cited equipment failure. The wedding cake designer claimed supply chain issues. Even the tent rental company suddenly had scheduling conflicts. But Alyssa's cruelest touch came at 8 p.m. when all 500 wedding guests received identical anonymous emails containing the hospital security footage. Dan shoving his 7 months pregnant wife, Dan refusing to help her during a medical emergency, Dan having her dragged from their home by security guards while she begged for mercy. The subject line read, "Tomorrow's groom, hero or monster. You decide." The email included a detailed timeline: Dan's affair with his assistant for 2 years of his marriage, his abandonment of his pregnant wife during a medical emergency, his lies to family and friends about her death to avoid embarrassment, FBI documentation of his systematic fraud and tax evasion. By midnight, Dan's guest list had evaporated. Senators sent regrets, citing scheduling conflicts. CEOs withdrew due to family emergencies. Even his own board members found sudden reasons to avoid association with him. The few remaining guests received one final email at 2 a.m. "For those still planning to attend tomorrow's ceremony, please know that you will be witnessing not a wedding but a reckoning. The bride is a fraud, the groom is a felon, and the marriage is a sham. But justice has a way of crashing even the most exclusive parties. Someone who knows the truth. Dan didn't sleep. He paced his penthouse, watching his perfect life disintegrate in real time through news coverage and social media feeds. By dawn, his wedding had become a global spectacle, not of wealth and power, but of public humiliation. The morning papers were brutal. Billionaire's bride revealed as con artist. The wedding that exposed a monster. How the 1% really lives. Cruelty, deception, and domestic violence. But the cruelest revelation came in a hand-delivered envelope that arrived with his morning coffee. Inside was a wedding invitation, but not one he'd sent. This one was elegant, expensive, and addressed to people Dan had never invited. Journalists, prosecutors, FBI agents, and every major CEO in the country. The invitation read, "You are cordially invited to witness the wedding of Daniel Robinson to Kinsley Whitmore and the revelation of truths that will change everything you thought you knew about America's richest man." At the bottom, in elegant script, special guest appearance by the supposedly deceased Mrs. Eliza Robinson and the son Mr. Robinson tried to eliminate. The invitation included a program for the ceremony, 2 p.m. processional music, 2:15 p.m. opening remarks, 2:30 p.m. exchange of vows, if the groom isn't under arrest, 2:45 p.m. presentation of evidence, 3 p.m. federal indictments, 3:15 p.m. reception, dress code, orange jumpsuits optional. Dan's phone exploded with calls, his mother crying and confused about references to a living daughter-in-law and grandson, his board of directors demanding emergency meetings, government officials asking about tax investigations that had suddenly materialized, competitors gleefully anticipating his downfall. But the final, devastating touch came as a personal note, delivered by hand and written in Alyssa's familiar script. Dan, 5 years ago you told me I was never enough for a man like you. Tomorrow you'll discover what a woman like me can do to a man like you. You threw away a family that loved you for a woman who was using you. You chose money over love, power over humanity, cruelty over kindness. Now you'll lose everything in front of everyone who matters. I didn't just survive your betrayal, Dan. I used it as fuel to become everything you said I could never be. While you were playing king, I was building an empire. While you were destroying lives, I was saving them. While you were forgetting how to be human, I was raising our son to be everything you're not. Tomorrow the world will meet David, the child you wanted dead, who grew into the kind of person you never had the strength to be. They'll see what love can build from the ashes of your cruelty. See you at the altar, the wife you buried alive and the son who survived your hatred. Dan Robinson, who had built an empire on ruthless calculation, realized he had made a fatal miscalculation 5 years ago. He hadn't just thrown away his wife and child, he had created his own destroyer. And tomorrow, in front of the world's most powerful people, she would complete her masterpiece of revenge. Chapter 4. The Ghost at the Altar. There are moments when the past doesn't just catch up with you, it destroys your future while the whole world watches in real time. The Robinson Hamptons estate had been transformed into what was supposed to be the wedding of the century. Instead, it resembled a crime scene waiting to happen. Massive white tents dotted the manicured lawns, filled with 500 of America's elite who had come not to celebrate, but to witness what they sensed would be a spectacular public destruction. News helicopters circled overhead like vultures. Social media was exploding with live updates from inside the venue. Dan Robinson stood at the altar in his $15,000 custom tuxedo, sweat beading on his forehead despite the October chill. His hands shook as he gripped the sides of the podium, surveying the crowd that felt more like a tribunal than a celebration. Half the invited guests hadn't shown, scared off by the mysterious revelations and swirling rumors. But the other half had come precisely because they smelled blood in the water. In New York society, there was nothing more entertaining than watching someone fall from grace in spectacular fashion. Kinsley walked down the aisle in her $200,000 Vera Wang gown, but her usual predatory confidence had cracked. The video of her multiple affairs had leaked to gossip blogs overnight, and every step she took was accompanied by whispers and barely concealed snickers from the crowd. She looked like a beautiful woman walking to her execution. "Dearly beloved," began Reverend Matthews, a replacement minister hastily hired after 3 others had refused the job citing ethical concerns. "We are gathered here today to join Daniel and Kinsley in holy matrimony." "Stop!" The voice came from the back of the elegant pavilion, clear and commanding enough to silence 500 people instantly. Every head turned as if choreographed. A woman stood in the entrance, backlit by autumn sunlight streaming through the tent opening. She was breathtaking, not in the artificial purchased way of society wives, but with a natural elegance and strength that made every other woman in attendance fade into background noise. "I'm sorry to interrupt," the woman said, her voice carrying easily across the silent crowd, "but this wedding cannot proceed." Dan's legs nearly gave out. It was impossible, but it was her. Older, poised, radiating a confidence and power he'd never seen in her before, but unmistakably Alyssa. And beside her, holding her hand with perfect trust, stood a small boy who looked exactly like Dan had at that age. Who are you?" Kinsley stammered, though something in her face suggested she already knew exactly who this woman was. "I'm Special Agent Alyssa Turner, FBI Financial Crimes Division," she replied, walking slowly down the aisle with her son's hand in hers, her heels clicking against the temporary wooden flooring like a countdown timer. "Also known as Mrs. Daniel Robinson, his first wife." The crowd erupted. Gasps rippled through the assembled elite like a shockwave. Phones appeared instantly, cameras flashed, live streams began. This was already the most scandalous event in New York social history, and it was just beginning. "That's impossible," Dan found his voice, though it cracked like a teenager's. "You're dead. You died 5 years ago in childbirth." Alyssa smiled, and it was the most terrifying expression Dan had ever seen. Beautiful, cold, and absolutely certain of victory. "Did I, Dan? Or is that just what you told everyone because it was easier than admitting you threw out your pregnant wife like garbage?" She reached into her purse with practiced calm and pulled out her federal badge, holding it up for the crowd to see. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm here in an official capacity. Mr. Robinson, you are under arrest for embezzlement, money laundering, tax evasion, securities fraud, and racketeering." The world stopped spinning. Dan stared at the badge, his mind refusing to process what he was seeing. "FBI? You? What? This is impossible." "Daniel Robinson." Alyssa's voice took on the official tone of federal law enforcement, echoing through the silent tent. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." "This is insane." Dan backed away from her, stumbling slightly. "You can't be FBI. You're my wife. You died." "I'm Agent Turner now, Dan. I've been investigating your criminal enterprise for the past 5 years. Every bribe you paid, every tax return you falsified, every competitor you illegally sabotaged, every crime you committed. I documented it all." FBI agents began emerging from the crowd like magic tricks in reverse. They had been disguised as wedding guests, photographers, caterers, even musicians. The elaborate setup was breathtaking in its scope and planning. "This whole thing was a setup," someone in the crowd whispered, and the murmur spread like wildfire. "The marriage was my deep cover," Alyssa continued conversationally, her voice carrying to every corner of the tent as agents moved to flank Dan. When you threw me out 5 years ago, pregnant and bleeding, I didn't just disappear. I went straight to the FBI with evidence of your crimes. But Turner Global, your business empire, is an FBI front company, Dan. Every acquisition, every business deal, every mysterious success was carefully orchestrated to give you enough rope to hang yourself. We needed you to get sloppy, arrogant, overconfident. And you did, spectacularly. Kinsley's face had gone white as printer paper. You mean, the whole time I was working for us? Oh, yes. Agent Kinsley Whitmore, FBI Financial Crimes Division. Every conversation you had with Dan, every intimate moment, every detail about his illegal activities, all recorded for federal prosecutors. The crowd was in chaos. Some guests were streaming toward exits, others were pushing forward to see better. Camera phones captured every moment of Dan's public humiliation, while news helicopters circled overhead, broadcasting his downfall live to millions of viewers. Wait, Dan's voice was barely a whisper. Kinsley, you're FBI too. Agent Braxton Whitfield stepped forward, Dan's supposed best friend, now wearing an FBI windbreaker and looking like he'd been waiting 5 years for this moment. 10-year veteran Dan. When Alyssa came to us 5 years ago, bleeding and terrified, telling us about your criminal empire, I volunteered to get close to you. Every conversation we've had, every poker game, every golf outing, all recorded. Dan looked around wildly, his world completely disintegrating. His mother sat in the front row, weeping. His business associates were backing away like he had a contagious disease. Kinsley was conferring with federal prosecutors. "This is my son," Alyssa said, lifting David up so he could see over the crowd of adults. "David Turner. The baby you told me to get rid of 5 years ago." She knelt to David's level, keeping her voice gentle despite the surrounding chaos. "David, can you say hello to all the nice people?" David waved with the innocent friendliness of a child who had been raised with love and confidence. "Hi, everyone. My mommy is really good at catching bad people." The crowd's collective gasp at the child's innocence was audible. This wasn't just a business scandal anymore. This was a father's rejection of his own child being exposed in the most public way possible. "Daddy?" David's small voice was curious as he looked at Dan for the first time. "Are you the man who made Mommy cry when I was in her tummy?" The crowd fell silent, waiting for Dan's response to his son's innocent question. "Yes, sweetheart," Alyssa said gently when Dan couldn't speak. "That's him." "Why did you make Mommy sad when she was growing me?" David asked Dan directly, with the brutal honesty only children possess. Dan's throat closed. He couldn't explain corporate fraud and tax evasion to a kindergartner, but a child's moral universe was simple. You don't hurt pregnant mommies. "He was confused, baby," Alyssa said diplomatically. "Sometimes grown-ups make very bad choices." "Like hitting?" David asked, because his mother had taught him about appropriate behavior. "Like hitting," Alyssa confirmed. The metaphor was perfect for a 5-year-old to understand, and devastating for the watching crowd of sophisticated adults who suddenly saw Dan's crimes through a child's eyes. As federal agents cuffed Dan, he looked at Alyssa one last time. "Why?" he whispered. "Why go through all this elaborate setup? Why not just arrest me quietly?" Alyssa's smile was beautiful and terrible, the expression of a woman who had orchestrated the perfect revenge. "Because, Dan, you didn't just commit crimes against me. You committed crimes against hundreds of investors, thousands of employees, countless families whose lives you destroyed for profit. They deserve to see justice served publicly. But mostly," she continued, "I wanted everyone who ever admired you, everyone who ever wanted to be you, everyone who ever thought wealth justified cruelty to see exactly what you really are. You destroyed my life. No, Dan, You destroyed your own life when you chose money over love, power over family, cruelty over compassion. I just documented it. As Dan was led away in handcuffs, the crowd began to cheer, not for him, but for Alyssa and David, the woman who had survived ultimate betrayal and the innocent child who represented hope, triumphing over hate. But the most devastating moment came as Dan was being placed in the FBI vehicle. "Bye-bye, mean man," David called out, waving with innocent friendliness. "I hope jail teaches you to be nice to people." Even in handcuffs, facing life in prison, surrounded by federal agents, Dan Robinson had been judged and found wanting by his own 5-year-old son. The wedding that was supposed to crown Dan as American royalty had instead revealed him as a monster, destroyed by the family he'd thrown away and rebuilt into something infinitely stronger. Agent Alyssa Turner had orchestrated not just the perfect arrest, but the perfect public execution of a man who thought wealth made him untouchable. The Queen had returned to reclaim her throne, and her reign of justice was just beginning. Chapter 5. The Evidence Unfolds. The most terrifying moment for a predator is realizing they've been the prey all along, and the hunt is finally over. Dan Robinson sat in a federal holding cell for 36 hours before his team of lawyers managed to secure his release on a $75 million bond, the largest in New York federal court history. When he finally emerged into the Manhattan morning, blinking like a vampire exposed to sunlight, he discovered that his world had fundamentally shifted overnight. The footage of his arrest at his own wedding had gone viral beyond anything in social media history. Dead Wife Revenge was trending worldwide with over 50 million posts. Late-night talk show hosts had devoted entire monologues to the billionaire who threw away his family and got served by the FBI in a wedding dress. Saturday Night Live had already announced a special episode dedicated to his downfall. But the public humiliation was nothing compared to what awaited him at home. His penthouse, the 15,000-square-foot sanctuary where he'd rebuilt his life after discarding Alyssa, had been transformed into a federal crime scene. FBI agents swarmed through every room like ants at a picnic, photographing, cataloging, and seizing evidence of crimes that had been hiding in plain sight for years. Mr. Robinson, Agent Sarah Hendricks, the lead investigator, looked up from a box of documents with the satisfied expression of a hunter who'd finally cornered her prey. "Welcome home. Hope you don't mind. We're just collecting some evidence of your criminal enterprise." Dan watched in horror as agents carried out computers, files, hard drives, artwork, jewelry, the digital and physical architecture of his entire empire being loaded into unmarked vans. "You can't just take everything. I have businesses to run, employees depending on me." "Actually, we can. And frankly, Mr. Robinson, your business-running days are permanently over." Agent Hendricks handed Dan a manila folder thick enough to choke a horse. "Federal asset seizure order signed this morning by Judge Harrison. Every company, every account, every property, every asset connected to your criminal enterprise has been frozen pending forfeiture proceedings." Dan's hands shook as he read the document. Robinson Industries, his life's work, his investment portfolio worth $8 billion, his homes in the Hamptons, Aspen, and Monaco, his yacht, his private jet, his art collection worth $300 million, his Swiss bank accounts, his cryptocurrency holdings, even his vintage car collection. Everything was gone, frozen, seized, or under federal control. "This is impossible. I had the best accountants, the most expensive lawyers, the most sophisticated financial advisors. You had criminals, Mr. Robinson, and Agent Turner had 5 years to document every single transaction, every bribe, every falsified record. Your best accountants have been cooperating with us for 3 years." The revelation hit Dan like a sledgehammer to the chest. What? Did you really think Agent Turner spent 5 years building a business empire just to arrest you at your wedding? This operation involved 47 federal agents, forensic accountants, financial analysts, undercover operatives, and legal experts. Turner Global wasn't just a front company, it was the most sophisticated financial crimes investigation in FBI history. Agent Hendricks opened her laptop and showed Dan a video feed from what appeared to be a federal briefing room. It was Alyssa, Agent Turner, addressing dozens of agents, prosecutors, and financial experts, all focused on massive evidence boards that mapped out his entire criminal network. For 5 years, Alyssa's voice came through the laptop speakers with professional authority. Daniel Robinson believed he was untouchable because of his wealth and political connections. He built his empire on systematic fraud, bribery, and tax evasion, thinking his money made him above the law. The camera panned across the briefing room, revealing charts, graphs, financial analyses, and evidence boards that looked like something from a Pentagon war room. The scope was breathtaking. 5 years of documentation, thousands of hours of surveillance, millions of documents cataloged and cross-referenced. Today we prove that no one, no matter how rich, how connected, or how powerful, can escape justice in America. Dan stared at the screen, watching his life's work being dissected by federal experts like a biology class frog. She's been building a case against me since the night I threw her out. Actually, she'd been documenting your criminal activities for 2 years before that. Agent Turner approached us during your marriage when she first discovered your offshore accounts and money laundering operations. She was planning to leave you quietly, but then she got pregnant and everything changed. Agent Hendricks closed the laptop with a snap. When you threw out your pregnant wife and told her to get rid of your child, you didn't just commit domestic abuse, Mr. Robinson. You threatened the life of a federal informant and her unborn child. That made it personal for every agent in this office. Dan sank into his leather chair, one of the few pieces of furniture not being photographed or seized. She played me. For 5 years, she played me perfectly. She survived you, Mr. Robinson, and she made sure you could never hurt anyone else the way you hurt her. The study door opened and Kinsley walked in, flanked by 2 FBI agents and looking like she'd aged 10 years overnight. Her perfect hair was disheveled, her designer clothes wrinkled, her usual predatory confidence completely shattered. "Danny," she said, and her voice was different now, smaller, scared, human. "We need to talk." Agent Hendricks stood up, gathering her files. "Actually, Agent Whitmore needs to give her final debriefing. She's been undercover for 2 years, gathering evidence of your personal crimes, while Agent Turner handled the financial investigation." Dan stared at his almost wife in shock. "You're really FBI?" "Financial Crimes Division, specialized in white-collar investigations. I've been an agent for 8 years." Kinsley couldn't meet his eyes. "When Agent Turner needed someone to get close to you, to document your personal criminal activities and psychological patterns, I volunteered. But you loved me. We were getting married." Kinsley's laugh was bitter, exhausted. "I'm a trained undercover operative, Dan. Creating false emotional connections is part of the job. But after hearing the recordings of how you treated Agent Turner and your son, after learning that you hoped your pregnant wife would die, I couldn't wait to help destroy you." Dan looked around his study, his sanctuary, his private domain, and realized that every conversation, every phone call, every intimate moment of his life for the past 2 years had been monitored, recorded, and analyzed by federal agents. The jewelry, the engagement ring, everything was bugged. Not just bugged, Dan. The jewelry was manufactured by FBI technical specialists. Your watch, your cufflinks, your wedding ring, even your glasses frames, all custom-made with surveillance technology invisible to any security sweep. Every business meeting you attended while wearing those items was recorded in federal evidence vaults. Every private phone call, every illegal transaction, every conversation where you admitted to bribing officials or hiding money. We got it all. Dan felt his sanity slipping away like water through his fingers. Even my most private moments were surveillance operations. The other men in the video, he whispered, your supposed affairs. FBI agents playing their parts, gathering supplementary evidence, making sure you'd be angry enough to say incriminating things when you discovered the infidelity. Your emotional responses to betrayal were just another data point in building our psychological profile. Even my heartbreak was evidence. Everything was evidence, Dan. Agent Turner choreographed your destruction like a symphony, and you danced to every note without realizing the music was playing. Agent Hendricks returned with a thick federal indictment. Mr. Robinson, your trial date is set for 8 weeks from today. I strongly suggest you consider the government's plea offer because the evidence against you is comprehensive. What evidence? What could you possibly have that 17,000 hours of audio recordings documenting your crimes, financial records from 43 different offshore accounts, video surveillance from your homes, offices, and vehicles, testimony from 67 co-conspirators who are cooperating to reduce their own sentences. Plus, Agent Hendricks continued with professional satisfaction, Agent Turner's personal testimony about the domestic violence, child abandonment, and psychological abuse you inflicted during her pregnancy. As the FBI agents filed out of his study, Dan was left alone with Kinsley, the woman who'd shared his bed for 2 years while secretly building the case that would destroy him. "How long have you known about David?" he asked quietly. "Since my first day undercover. Agent Turner showed me photos, videos of him learning to walk, saying his first words, starting kindergarten. Every milestone you missed because you were too cruel to accept your own child. He's remarkable, Dan. Brilliant, kind, funny, creative, everything a father should be proud of. And he's been raised by a mother who never spoke ill of you, even though you tried to kill them both." Dan closed his eyes, feeling the weight of his perfect, devastating defeat. What happens now? Now you face the consequences of every choice you made, every crime you committed, every person you hurt, every bridge you burned. It all comes due. Dan's phone buzzed with an incoming call, unknown number, but somehow he knew who it was. "Hello, Dan." Alyssa's voice was calm, almost gentle. "How?" he whispered into the phone. "How did you become this? Pain, Dan. The kind of pain you inflicted when you threw away a pregnant woman and unborn child teaches you exactly how strong you really are." Dan could hear David's laughter in the background, the sound of a happy child who'd been raised with love despite his father's cruelty. "You destroyed everything I built. I exposed everything you stole. There's a difference. I'm going to prison for the rest of my life." "Yes, you are. But not because I destroyed you, Dan. Because you destroyed yourself the moment you chose cruelty over love." "What about David? What about our son?" "David is perfect. He's 5 years old, speaks 2 languages, loves dinosaurs and space, and wants to be a doctor when he grows up so he can help people. He's everything you could have been proud of, if you'd been capable of love. Does he ever ask about me? He asks about the mean man who hurt his mommy sometimes. I tell him that some people have broken hearts that make them do bad things, but that doesn't make it okay. I want to see him. That will never happen, Dan. You made your choice 5 years ago. Now live with the consequences." The line went dead, leaving Dan alone in his empty penthouse with the echo of his son's laughter and the weight of his perfect, irreversible defeat. Late that night, Alyssa sat in her home office, staring at surveillance photos of Dan's devastated face as he'd been led away in handcuffs. She should feel triumphant. Instead, she felt empty. "Mommy?" David's small voice made her jump. He stood in the doorway in his dinosaur pajamas, rubbing his eyes. "Why are you sad? I thought you'd be happy that the bad man got caught." Alyssa realized she was crying, not from sadness, but from the complex relief of a 5-year mission finally completed. Sometimes, baby, even when justice happens, it doesn't feel the way you expect it to. David climbed onto her lap, studying the photos on her desk. "He looks really sad." "He should be sad. He did terrible things to people." "But you look sad too, Mommy." Alyssa held her son closer, realizing that revenge, even perfect revenge, felt nothing like she'd imagined. That seeing Dan's complete destruction didn't heal the wounds he'd left. It just created space for something better to grow. "I'm not sad, sweetheart. I'm tired. But it's the good kind of tired, like after you finish building something really important." "What did you build, Mommy?" "Justice, baby. I built justice." And for the first time in 5 years, Alyssa Turner Robinson felt truly free. Chapter 6. The Sun's First Strike. Sometimes the most devastating blow comes from the smallest, most innocent voice telling the truth the whole world needs to hear. The 60 Minutes interview was broadcast live from the Turner family's elegant living room, a deliberate choice that showed America what a real home looked like. Soft lighting, children's artwork on the walls, family photos that radiated genuine love. The contrast to Dan's cold penthouse was stark and intentional. 58 million Americans tuned in, making it the most watched news program in television history. They came for the scandal, but stayed for something far more powerful. A 5-year-old boy who would change how the country thought about family, fathers, and forgiveness. "Agent Turner," Margaret Chen began, "you've been called America's most remarkable woman, FBI agent, business mogul, single mother. But tonight, we're here to meet someone even more remarkable, your son David." David sat between his mother's arms, wearing a simple blue sweater and khaki pants. At 5 years old, he possessed an unusual composure, the result of growing up in boardrooms and federal briefings. But his smile was pure childhood joy. "Hi, everyone," David said, waving at the camera with the unself-conscious friendliness that only children possess. "David, can you tell us about your family?" "I have the best mommy in the whole world," David said without hesitation. "She works really hard to help people, and she reads me stories every night, and she makes really good pancakes that look like dinosaurs." "What about your father, David?" "Do you know about your biological father?" David's expression grew thoughtful. "Mommy told me that some daddies can't take care of their kids because they have broken hearts. My biological father has a broken heart, so he can't be a daddy right now." The simple, compassionate explanation, clearly crafted by Alyssa to protect her son from harsh truths, was devastating in its innocence. "How do you feel about that?" "I feel sad for him," David said seriously. "Mommy says when people have broken hearts, they sometimes do mean things. But I'm not sad for me because I have Mommy and Uncle Braxton and Grandma Eleanor, and they love me so much I don't feel like anything is missing." In his penthouse, Dan watched his son's radiant face and felt something die inside his chest. This beautiful, articulate, loving child was talking about him with pity. Not anger, not hatred, but genuine sympathy for his broken heart. "David, your mother has told us some difficult things about what happened when you were born. Do you understand any of that?" "I know my biological father didn't want me to be born," David said matter-of-factly. "But Mommy wanted me so much that she fought really hard to make sure I could be here. She almost died making sure I was born safe." "How does that make you feel?" David considered this with the seriousness children bring to important questions. "It makes me feel really lucky that Mommy loved me enough to fight for me, and it makes me feel sad that my biological father was too scared to love me. Scared? Mommy says some grown-ups get scared when they have to take care of someone else. But real daddies aren't scared. They're brave for their kids. Margaret Chen leaned forward. David, if you could say anything to your biological father, what would it be? David looked directly into the camera, and for a moment every viewer felt like he was speaking directly to them. I would tell him that he doesn't have to be scared anymore. I'm a really good kid. I get good grades, and I help Mommy with groceries, and I never throw tantrums in stores. If he wasn't scared, maybe he could be proud of me. The studio was dead silent. Even the camera operators had tears in their eyes. I would also tell him, David continued, that it's okay that he couldn't be my daddy, because Uncle Braxton teaches me to play baseball, and Grandma Eleanor makes me cookies, and Mommy loves me enough for 100 parents. And I would tell him that I hope his broken heart gets better someday, because being mean to people just makes hearts more broken. Dan's phone began ringing immediately, reporters, lawyers, former associates, but he ignored it all, transfixed by his son's innocent wisdom. David, Margaret asked gently, is there anything else you want people to know? I want other kids who have broken heart parents to know that it's not their fault. Kids don't break parents' hearts. Parents break their own hearts by forgetting how to love. And I want to say thank you to all the nice people who sent me letters after Mommy arrested the bad people. You made me feel really special. The interview concluded with footage of David and Alyssa at the Central Park Zoo, feeding ducks and laughing together. The message was clear. This was what healing looked like. This was what love could build from the ashes of cruelty. But the real devastation came in the aftermath. Within an hour, younger David Turner was trending worldwide, but the messages weren't just supportive, they were revolutionary. This 5-year-old has more emotional intelligence than most adults. What a remarkable child. If you abandoned a kid like this, you don't deserve to breathe the same air as him. David Turner just taught America what forgiveness looks like. We don't deserve this child. But the cruelest responses were the most personal. Daniel Robinson had this child and threw him away. There's a special place in hell. I've been married 20 years, and my husband just watched this interview and said, if I ever become the kind of man who could abandon a child like David, shoot me. Dan Robinson is going to be every husband's cautionary tale. The social media avalanche was unlike anything in American history. Mothers posted photos of their own children with the caption, "This is what Dan Robinson threw away." Fathers recorded videos apologizing to their own kids for smaller failures, using Dan as the ultimate example of paternal failure. But the most devastating response came from an unexpected source, America's most powerful women. By morning, 17 CEOs' wives had filed for divorce, citing their husbands' admiration for Dan Robinson's business tactics as evidence of moral bankruptcy. 3 governors' spouses issued public statements distancing themselves from their husbands' previous praise of Dan's success. The wife of Dan's biggest investor wrote in the New York Times, "Any man who could abandon a child like David Turner is capable of any cruelty. I refuse to let my children be raised by someone who sees Daniel Robinson as a role model." Dan's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "This is David's mommy. He wanted me to send you something." The message included a video file. With trembling hands, Dan opened it. David was in his bedroom, surrounded by books and dinosaur toys, speaking directly to the camera. "Hi. Biological father. Mommy said I could make this video if I wanted to. I don't know if you'll see it, but I wanted to tell you some things. I saw on the news that people are saying mean things about you. I know you did bad things, but I don't think people should be mean. Mean things just make everyone sad. I wanted to tell you about my life, so maybe you won't feel so bad. I'm in kindergarten and I love reading and dinosaurs and helping mommy cook. My best friend is Marcus, and we're learning to play chess. Uncle Braxton is teaching me to ride a bicycle without training wheels. Mommy reads me a story every night before bed, and sometimes she makes up stories about dinosaurs who learn to be brave. She says being brave means doing the right thing, even when you're scared. I hope you're learning to be brave in jail. Maybe when your broken heart gets better, you can do right things for other kids who need help. I forgive you for not wanting me, because Mommy says forgiveness isn't about the other person. It's about not carrying angry feelings in your own heart. I hope you have nice dreams. The video ended with David waving goodbye with the same innocent friendliness he'd shown on television. Dan watched the video 17 times before the prison guards found him sobbing uncontrollably in his cell. His son, the child he'd wanted to eliminate, had just given him the only mercy he'd received from anyone in the world. A 5-year-old's pure-hearted forgiveness that he hadn't asked for and didn't deserve. The boy he'd thrown away had grown into the kind of person Dan had never been. Genuinely good. And in that moment, Dan Robinson finally understood what he'd really lost. Not just money or freedom or reputation. He'd lost the chance to be loved by the most remarkable child in America. His own son. Chapter 7. The Empire Strikes Back. Desperation makes dangerous men do stupid things, and stupid things create the evidence that destroys them forever. Dan Robinson hired the best criminal defense attorney money could buy, or rather, money he could borrow against his frozen assets while praying federal prosecutors wouldn't notice. Marcus Fitzgerald had never lost a white-collar case in 30 years of practice, commanded fees of $10,000 per hour, and had a reputation among New York's criminal elite as the man who could make miracles happen. He took one look at Dan's case file and said, "You're fucked, Dan. Completely, utterly, spectacularly fucked. That's what I'm paying you $10 million to unfuck. $10 million doesn't buy miracles. It buys competent representation as you negotiate the best possible deal for your inevitable conviction." Fitzgerald lifted a stack of folders that looked like the Encyclopedia Britannica. "They have recordings of you admitting to tax evasion. They have financial records showing systematic embezzlement of $847 million. They have testimony from 73 co-conspirators who've already pleaded guilty, all of whom are lying to save themselves. All of whom have corroborating evidence that matches the FBI's financial forensics down to the penny. Dan, your wife, Special Agent Turner, spent 5 years building this case. She has everything." Dan slammed his fist on the conference table, sending expensive pens scattering. "She's not an FBI agent. She's my dead wife who committed fraud by faking her own death." "Actually," Fitzgerald opened another file, "she's been a federal agent since 2 months after your son was born. The FBI recruited her specifically to investigate you." He showed Dan an official document with government seals and signatures. "Special Agent Alyssa Turner, Financial Crimes Division. Her undercover work on Operation Robinson Reckoning has been approved at the highest levels of the Justice Department." Dan's world tilted like a carnival ride. Operation Robinson Reckoning? That's what they called their 5-year investigation into your criminal enterprise. Cute, right? Very Hollywood. The FBI loves their dramatic code names. This is insane. I want to fight this. Dan, listen to me very carefully. If you go to trial with this evidence, you're looking at 65 years in federal prison. The government is offering you a plea deal, 25 years in exchange for full cooperation and complete asset forfeiture. 25 years. It's a gift wrapped in a bow and tied with a ribbon. Take it, Dan. Take it and thank whatever God you pray to that they're being merciful. Dan stood up, pacing to the window overlooking Manhattan, the city he'd once believed he ruled, now looking down at him like a disappointed parent. I want custody of my son. Fitzgerald nearly choked on his coffee. I'm sorry, what now? David, I want joint custody. It's my parental right. Dan, you're a federal criminal who told your pregnant wife to abort your child and then pretended they were both dead for 5 years. You have about as many parental rights as a rabid wolverine. I'm still his biological father. I have constitutional rights. You're a domestic abuser who threatened the life of an unborn child. The Constitution doesn't protect monsters, Dan. But Dan was already formulating his strategy. If he couldn't win on the criminal charges, maybe he could destroy Alyssa's perfect new life by taking what mattered most to her. Maybe he could force her into a position where she'd have to negotiate, compromise, show mercy. Maybe he still had one card to play. File the custody petition. Today. Dan, this is legal suicide. File it. I'm not going to prison for 65 years while she gets to play happy family with my son. Your son doesn't know you exist, Dan. Your son calls another man Daddy and has been raised to believe you're dangerous. Then it's time he learned the truth about his real father. 3 days later, the custody petition hit the media like a nuclear bomb. Billionaire felon seeks custody of son. He wanted dead, screamed the New York Post headline, accompanied by side-by-side photos of Dan in handcuffs and David waving at his mother's FBI awards ceremony. The public reaction was immediate, brutal, and overwhelming. Protesters gathered outside Dan's penthouse with signs reading "Child Abandoner" and "Deadbeat Daddy." Death threats flooded his voicemail from parents across America who saw his custody claim as the ultimate act of narcissistic cruelty. Even his own lawyer received angry calls from colleagues questioning his ethical standards for representing such a case. But Dan felt like he was fighting back for the first time in months instead of just absorbing punishment. The feeling lasted exactly 18 hours. Dan. Alyssa's voice on his phone was calm, almost amused, the tone of a chess master who'd just been handed an unexpected victory. I heard about your custody petition. It's my right as his biological father. Actually, it's not, but I'm glad you filed it, because now I can show the world exactly what kind of father you really were. The next morning, Dan woke to find his legal strategy in ruins, and his public image destroyed beyond repair. Security footage from their penthouse building, carefully archived by Alyssa during their marriage, showed Dan shoving his 7 months pregnant wife during an argument. Medical records from Manhattan General Hospital documented injuries consistent with domestic violence and noted that patient expressed fear of spouse. Hospital recordings captured Dan telling doctors he didn't give a damn if Alyssa or the baby survived her complications. But the most devastating evidence came from an unexpected source: Dan's own mother. Eleanor Robinson, now 75 and legally sharp despite her age, filed an affidavit with the family court that systematically destroyed any chance Dan had of winning custody or retaining a shred of human dignity. My son Daniel Robinson told me and other family members that his wife and child had died in childbirth, the affidavit read in clinical, devastating detail. He showed no grief at their supposed deaths and actively discouraged us from holding memorial services or creating any remembrance. When I suggested we plant a memorial garden for Alyssa and the baby, he told me to let the dead stay dead and never speak of them again. When I expressed sadness at losing a daughter-in-law and grandson, he said I should be grateful because they would have been burdens on the family reputation. He described his wife as weak, pathetic, and forgettable, and said the child probably would have been as worthless as his mother anyway. When I expressed horror at his callousness, he laughed and said, "Mother, you're too sentimental. They were liabilities I couldn't afford." The affidavit continued with devastating precision, each paragraph more damning than the last. During family dinners, Daniel would make jokes about getting rid of dead weight and cleaning house. When I asked what he meant, he said he was talking about business, but his smile suggested he was referring to something more personal. When David was supposedly born and died, Daniel celebrated with champagne and told me, "One less problem to worry about. Now I can focus on what really matters, building wealth." In my opinion, as his mother, who has known Daniel for 45 years, he is emotionally and morally incapable of caring for any child. His complete lack of empathy, his celebration of supposed deaths, and his narcissistic inability to consider anyone's needs besides his own make him unfit for any form of custody or visitation. I have now met my grandson, David, who is a remarkable, kind, and intelligent child who has been raised with love and security by his mother. I believe it would be psychologically harmful and potentially dangerous for David to have any contact with Daniel Robinson. I am ashamed that I raised a son capable of such cruelty, and I pray that David never becomes the kind of man his biological father chose to be. The affidavit was signed, notarized, filed publicly, and immediately became front-page news across the country. Dan's own mother, the woman who had loved him unconditionally for 45 years, had just testified that he was unfit to be around children. Dan called Eleanor immediately, his voice shaking with rage and desperation. "How could you do this to me? I'm your son." "No." Eleanor's voice was steady as steel. "My son died the night he threw away his pregnant wife and celebrated what he thought was his child's death. You're just a stranger wearing his face. I'm fighting for my child. You're fighting to hurt Alyssa, and you're willing to traumatize an innocent 5-year-old to do it. That's exactly why you should never be alone with that boy. He's my son, my blood. Biology isn't fatherhood, Daniel. Braxton Whitfield has been more of a father to David in 6 months than you've been in his entire life. That child calls Braxton uncle and hugs him like family, while he doesn't even know your name. I can change. I can be better. No, you can't, because you don't think you've done anything wrong. Even now, facing 65 years in prison, you're trying to use an innocent child as a weapon against his mother. That's who you are, Danny. That's who you've always been, deep down. When the custody hearing arrived 2 weeks later, the courtroom was packed with reporters, child advocates, and members of the public who had followed the case obsessively. Dan sat alone at the defendant's table while Alyssa was surrounded by FBI agents, family lawyers, child psychologists, and domestic violence advocates. The Honorable Patricia Williams had clearly read every document in the case, and her expression suggested she was personally offended by Dan's petition. "Mr. Robinson," she began with judicial ice in her voice, "your petition for custody is not only denied, but I am issuing a comprehensive restraining order. You are prohibited from contacting David Turner Robinson directly or indirectly, from approaching his school or residence, from making any future custody claims, and from attempting any form of communication with the child. Your Honor, I have constitutional parental rights." "Mr. Robinson, you forfeited those rights when you abandoned your pregnant wife, told everyone your child was dead, and showed celebration rather than grief at his supposed death. The evidence shows you pose a clear and present danger to the child's emotional, psychological, and potentially physical well-being," Judge Williams continued, her voice growing stronger. "Your attempt to gain custody while facing federal charges for financial crimes appears to be motivated not by paternal love, but by a desire to inflict further psychological harm on the child's mother. This court will not allow a child to be weaponized in your vendetta." Furthermore, the testimony from your own mother indicates a pattern of psychological cruelty and emotional abuse that makes you fundamentally unsuited for any contact with children. The restraining order is permanent and non-negotiable. If you violate it in any way, if you attempt to contact this child, approach him, send him letters, gifts, or messages through third parties, you will face additional federal charges for stalking and harassment. Your Honor, please. Mr. Robinson, fatherhood requires love, sacrifice, empathy, and the ability to put a child's needs above your own desires. You have demonstrated none of these qualities. This child deserves protection from you, not exposure to you. As Dan left the courthouse, reporters shouted questions about his crushing legal defeat. But the real humiliation came that evening when David appeared on a children's news program to thank all the nice people who want to protect kids. The judge is really smart, David told the interviewer with 5-year-old confidence and clarity. She knows that real daddies don't try to hurt their kids' mommies. Real daddies protect their families. And if someone is being mean to your family, you should tell the police because they're really good at stopping mean people. But Dan's desperate custody petition had an unintended consequence that shattered Alyssa's carefully constructed world. "Mommy," David said quietly that night after watching news coverage of the custody hearing, "was that man really my daddy?" They were sitting in David's bedroom, the same room in the Robinson mansion where Dan had once slept as a child, and Alyssa felt the weight of 5 years of careful protection cracking under her son's innocent question. "Yes, sweetheart, biologically. But he didn't want me when I was in your tummy." Alyssa felt her throat close with emotion. "No, baby, he didn't." David was quiet for a long moment, processing with the serious concentration only children possess. Then, "Mommy, are you sure I'm not bad like him?" The question hit Alyssa like a physical blow. Her 5-year-old son, brilliant, kind, innocent David, was wondering if he carried his father's cruelty in his DNA. "David, you are nothing like him. You're good and sweet and kind. But what if I turn mean when I grow up? What if the bad daddy part is inside me too?" Alyssa realized with horror that her perfect revenge had come with a cost she'd never calculated. Her son was now questioning his own worth because of his biological connection to a monster. For the first time in 5 years, she wondered if destroying Dan had been worth it, if justice was worth her child's potential psychological damage. "David, listen to me very carefully," she said, pulling him close. "Being good or bad isn't about your blood, it's about your choices. Every day you choose to be kind, to help people, to care about others. That's what makes you who you are, not who your biological father is." "But Uncle Braxton says some people are just broken inside." "Uncle Braxton is right. Some people are broken. But that doesn't mean their children are broken too. You have my heart, baby. You have Uncle Braxton's love, Grandma Eleanor's wisdom, and most importantly, you have your own beautiful soul." David smiled, but Alyssa could see the seeds of doubt that Dan's custody petition had planted in her son's mind. Dan Robinson, who had tried to weaponize the legal system against his own family, had managed to inflict one final wound on the child he'd never wanted, making an innocent 5-year-old question his own worth. And somehow that felt like the cruelest victory of all. Chapter 8. The Final Pieces Fall. The cruelest revenge is not destroying what someone loves. It's taking everything they are and making it yours. The moving trucks arrived at the Robinson family mansion at dawn, just as Eleanor Robinson was having her morning coffee in the sunroom, where she'd spent 50 years watching Manhattan wake up. Mrs. Robinson, the head of the moving crew, looked genuinely pained to disturb the elderly woman. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but we're here for the Turner Global acquisition. Everything needs to be out by noon." Eleanor nodded with quiet dignity, though her hands trembled slightly as she set down her coffee cup. "Of course, the new owners are expected this afternoon." What the movers didn't know, what Dan didn't know, was that Alyssa had orchestrated the most personally devastating asset seizure in corporate history. She wasn't just taking buildings and bank accounts. She was erasing Daniel Robinson from existence. Alyssa arrived at the mansion an hour later with David, who was excited to see his new house. But as they walked through rooms filled with 4 generations of Robinson family history, Alyssa felt a weight she hadn't expected. "Mommy, why does the nice lady look so sad?" David whispered, noticing Eleanor's tears as movers carefully packed family portraits. "Because this house holds a lot of memories for her, sweetheart. It's hard to say goodbye to places we love." David approached Eleanor with the intuitive kindness that constantly amazed adults. "Don't be sad, Grandma Eleanor. We'll take really good care of your house." Eleanor knelt to David's level, studying the face that was so heartbreakingly like her son's had been at that age, before money and power had corrupted everything decent in Dan. "You're going to fill this house with love again, aren't you?" "Yes, ma'am. Mommy and I are really good at making places feel happy." As movers carried out furniture that had been in the Robinson family since the 1920s, Eleanor handed Alyssa a manila folder. "These are the real estate deeds, insurance policies, and family documentation you'll need. But there's something else I want you to have." She led Alyssa to the mansion's library, where a massive oil painting dominated one wall. 4 generations of Robinson men, painted in the style of classic family portraits. "This is Dan's great-great-grandfather who built Robinson Steel, his great-grandfather who survived the Depression, his grandfather who expanded into manufacturing, his father who moved the family into finance." Eleanor's voice carried the weight of a century of family pride. "And there," she pointed to the most recent edition, "is Danny, painted when he turned 30, back when I still believed he'd be a good man." "Eleanor, I can't take this." "Yes, you can, because that little boy," she gestured to David, who was carefully examining a globe in the corner, "is the real Robinson heir. Danny destroyed himself, but David carries the best of our family's blood. I want this painting to hang in his room, so he knows he comes from people who built things, who survived hard times, who believed family was more important than money, even if his biological father forgot those lessons." That afternoon, while Dan sat in federal holding awaiting trial, Alyssa's legal team completed the most comprehensive asset seizure in American legal history. Turner Global now owned the Fifth Avenue mansion where Dan was born, the Hamptons estate where he'd spent every childhood summer, Robinson Steel Works, founded by his great-great-grandfather in 1924, the family cemetery plots in Westchester, where 4 generations of Robinson men were buried, the Robinson Foundation, which had funded scholarships and charitable works for 70 years, the trademark and legal rights to the Robinson family name for commercial use, Dan's childhood medical records, school transcripts, and personal documents, even the family's coat of arms and genealogical records. But Alyssa's cruelest stroke was the most personal. She had purchased Dan's father's debts from before his death. Gambling obligations, failed investment loans, unpaid business expenses. When she called in those debts simultaneously, the Robinson estate couldn't pay. As a result, she now legally owned not just property, but memory itself. "I don't understand," Dan's lawyer, Marcus Fitzgerald, said during an emergency meeting at the federal courthouse. "How can she own your father's grave site?" "Unpaid cemetery fees," Alyssa's lawyer, Remington Blackwell, explained with professional coldness. Mr. Robinson's father owed $47,000 in maintenance fees and memorial costs when he died. Those debts were transferred to cemetery management, then sold to a collection agency, then purchased by Turner Global. When the debts went unpaid, the burial plots reverted to Turner Global ownership. Agent Turner now has the legal right to determine who can visit the Robinson family graves, who can be buried there, and what memorial markers are allowed. Dan stared at the legal documents, his hands shaking. She owns my father's headstone? She owns the land your father is buried in, Mr. Robinson. She owns the rights to the Robinson name on any commercial materials. She owns the house you were born in, the company your great-great-grandfather founded, the foundation your family built. She owns your entire legacy. But the psychological warfare was just beginning. That evening, as Dan sat alone in his penthouse, one of the few assets not yet seized, he received a package with no return address. Inside were his childhood photo albums, carefully preserved but now belonging to Turner Global. A note in Alyssa's handwriting read, "I thought you might want to see these one last time before they go to their new home in David's room." Dan opened the first album with trembling hands, photos of birthday parties in the mansion that now belonged to his son. Christmas mornings in the living room where David would soon open his own presents. Family vacations to the Hamptons estate where David would learn to swim in the same pool where Dan had learned 60 years ago. Every happy memory of his childhood would now be recreated by the son he'd abandoned, in the houses he'd lost, surrounded by the family legacy he'd destroyed. But the cruelest photo was the last one. Dan at age 5, the same age David was now, sitting on his father's lap in the mansion's library. Both of them smiling, both of them innocent, both of them believing that love and family were the most important things in the world. On the back, someone had written in child's handwriting, "My daddy and me in our house. Danny Robinson, age 5 inches. Below that, in Alyssa's elegant script, "Some legacies deserve to continue, others deserve to be erased. David will grow up in the home that should have been his, surrounded by the love you threw away. The Robinson name will live on, just not with you." Dan's phone rang. Unknown number. With numb fingers, he answered. "Dan?" Alyssa's voice was calm, professional. "I thought you should know. David is having his 6th birthday party next week, at the mansion. Eleanor is helping us plan it. You're destroying everything. I'm preserving everything that mattered and discarding what didn't. Your great-great-grandfather built that house for family, for children, for love. David will honor that legacy better than you ever did. He's my son. He's a Robinson heir who will be raised with Robinson values, kindness, integrity, family loyalty, everything you forgot how to be. When David grows up in that house, when he plays in that garden, when he sits in that library reading the same books you read as a child, he won't be haunted by your failures. He'll be inspired by the good men who came before you. You're erasing me from my own family history. No, Dan. You erased yourself the night you threw away everything that mattered. I'm just making sure David inherits the legacy you abandoned." The line went dead, leaving Dan alone in his empty penthouse, surrounded by the ruins of an empire he'd built on the grave of his own humanity. Outside his windows, Manhattan glittered in the darkness. Somewhere in that city, in the mansion that had been his birthright, his son was falling asleep in the room that had once been his, surrounded by the love Dan had thrown away. The Robinson legacy would continue, just not with the Robinson who'd forgotten what legacy meant, and somehow that was the most perfect justice of all. Chapter 9. The Reckoning begins. In the end, justice isn't about punishment. It's about truth being heard by those who have the power to make it matter. The federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan had never seen anything like United States vs. Daniel Robinson. Media trucks lined the streets for 6 blocks in every direction. International news crews broadcast live updates around the clock. The trial had become a global symbol of whether America's justice system could hold the ultra-wealthy accountable for their crimes. Dan Robinson sat at the defendant's table in a $15,000 suit that couldn't hide the fact that he'd aged 15 years in 15 weeks. His hands trembled constantly now, a side effect of the anxiety medication his doctor had prescribed to prevent panic attacks. His $5 million attorney, Marcus Fitzgerald, shuffled papers with the resigned air of a man preparing for execution. On the other side of the courtroom, FBI agent Alyssa Turner sat in the witness section with her 6-year-old son David on her lap. She'd been excused during opening arguments due to her status as the primary witness, but Judge Harrison had made an exception, allowing David to remain with his mother for emotional support. The boy sat quietly, coloring in a dinosaur book while his mother's testimony would determine his biological father's fate. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," lead prosecutor Sarah Chen began, walking toward the jury box with the confidence of someone holding a royal flush. "The defendant stands accused of systematically defrauding the American people of $847 million over 12 years. But this case is about more than financial crimes. It's about a man who destroyed everything decent in his life, his marriage, his family, his humanity, in pursuit of money and power. It's about a man who abandoned his pregnant wife and unborn child, then built an empire on the blood money of other people's suffering." Chen made eye contact with each of the 12 jurors who would decide Dan's fate. 6 men, 6 women, representing a cross-section of American society that Dan had spent his life exploiting. Over the next 3 weeks, you will hear evidence of crimes so extensive, so carefully planned, and so callously executed that they represent one of the largest financial fraud cases in federal history. You will learn how the defendant stole from pension funds, leaving elderly Americans without retirement security. How he defrauded veterans' charities, stealing money meant for wounded soldiers. How he evaded $312 million in taxes while American families struggled to pay their bills. You will also hear testimony about domestic violence, child abandonment, and a level of personal cruelty that will shock your conscience. Because Daniel Robinson didn't just steal money, he stole hope, security, and futures from hundreds of thousands of innocent people. Dan's defense attorney stood for his opening statement, looking like a man tasked with defending the indefensible. "Ladies and gentlemen, my client is not perfect. He made mistakes in his personal life, and he may have been aggressive in his business practices. But the prosecution wants you to convict Daniel Robinson, not for what he did, but for who he is. The real question you must ask yourselves is this: can a man receive a fair trial when his primary accuser is his ex-wife? A woman scorned who has spent 5 years planning an elaborate revenge scheme disguised as a federal investigation." Fitzgerald gestured toward Alyssa with theatrical skepticism. "Agent Turner is not an impartial law enforcement officer. She is a woman consumed by personal hatred, willing to abuse the power of federal law enforcement to destroy the man who left her." The first 2 weeks of testimony were a systematic demolition of Dan's defense. FBI forensic accountants walked the jury through financial records that read like a masterclass in criminal fraud. They showed PowerPoint presentations with charts, graphs, and timelines that mapped out 12 years of systematic theft. The defendant used a network of 47 shell companies across 17 countries to hide stolen money, testified Special Agent Marcus Webb, the FBI's lead financial crimes investigator. Every transaction was designed to obscure the source of funds and avoid federal oversight. He stole $127 million from pension funds by claiming the money was invested in legitimate securities, then used it to buy personal assets, yachts, artwork, real estate. He defrauded military veterans' charities of $89 million by creating fake humanitarian organizations, then funneled the money into offshore accounts. He evaded $312 million in federal taxes by claiming his personal expenses as business deductions, including his wedding, his vacations, even his son's private school tuition during the brief period he acknowledged having a child. Each day brought new revelations that painted Dan as a man who had turned theft into an art form. The jury saw financial records, bank statements, email communications, and recorded phone calls that documented 12 years of criminal behavior. But the prosecution's most powerful weapon wasn't financial evidence. It was human testimony. Margaret Santos, a 67-year-old retiree, testified through tears about losing her life savings when Dan's fraudulent investment fund collapsed. I trusted him because he was on television, saying he cared about working families. I lost everything, my retirement, my house, my security. I work at Walmart now just to afford my medications. James Mitchell, a disabled veteran, described how Dan's fake charity had promised to build housing for homeless veterans, then disappeared with $12 million in donations. My brothers served their country and came home broken. This man stole from them twice, once in war, once in peace. 17 victims testified over 5 days, each story more heartbreaking than the last. By the time they finished, several jurors were crying openly, but everyone in the courtroom knew the real drama would begin when Alyssa took the stand. When FBI Special Agent Alyssa Turner was sworn in on Monday of the third week, the courthouse was packed beyond capacity. Every major news network provided live coverage. Social media exploded with real-time commentary. Agent Turner, Prosecutor Chen began, "Please tell the jury about your relationship with the defendant." "I was married to Daniel Robinson for 7 years. During that time, I discovered evidence of his criminal activities and became a federal informant, later joining the FBI to investigate his crimes professionally." "Tell us about the night your marriage ended." Alyssa's voice remained steady and professional, but her hands gripped the witness stand. "I was 7 months pregnant when I discovered Daniel's affair with his assistant, Kinsley Whitmore. When I confronted him about the infidelity, he told me our marriage had been a business arrangement required by his grandfather's will." "What happened when you told him you were bleeding and needed medical attention?" "He refused to help me get to the hospital. When I asked him to drive me because I was having pregnancy complications, he said, and I quote, 'If you lose it, it saves me the trouble.'" A murmur of disgust rippled through the courtroom. Several jurors looked physically sick. What did he mean by lose it? He was referring to our unborn child. He wanted me to miscarry so he wouldn't have to deal with the complications of fatherhood. Prosecutor Chen introduced exhibit after exhibit. Hospital records showing Alyssa's injuries, security footage of Dan having her escorted from their home while she was in medical distress, financial records showing he'd frozen all her accounts while she was in emergency surgery giving birth. "Agent Turner, did you spend 5 years planning revenge against your ex-husband?" "I spent 5 years building a federal case against a dangerous criminal who happened to be my ex-husband. Every piece of evidence I gathered, every investigative technique I used, every action I took was approved by federal supervisors and reviewed by Justice Department prosecutors. Did your personal feelings influence your investigation?" Alyssa looked directly at Dan for the first time since taking the stand. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of evidence and public judgment. "Yes. My personal experience as his victim made me understand how dangerous he was to other people, but every piece of evidence in this case stands on its own merit. The financial records are authentic. The recorded conversations speak for themselves. The testimony from co-conspirators is corroborated by independent evidence. The defense's cross-examination lasted 2 days and was brutal but ineffective. Agent Turner, isn't it true that you used federal resources to conduct a personal vendetta? Number Y used federal resources to investigate federal crimes that had been ongoing for over a decade before I became involved. Isn't it true that you manipulated the FBI into opening this investigation? The FBI opened this investigation because Daniel Robinson committed serious federal crimes affecting hundreds of thousands of victims. My personal history with him made me an effective undercover agent, nothing more. You've profited enormously from this investigation, haven't you? Your business empire is now worth billions. Turner Global is a legitimate business built with private capital after my FBI service. Every transaction has been reviewed by federal auditors. Every profit has been declared and properly taxed. Unlike the defendant, I follow the law. The defense called character witnesses, former employees, business associates, charity board members who testified to Dan's donations and community involvement. But their impact was minimal compared to the prosecution's rebuttal. The government played audio recordings, dozens of them, of Dan describing his crimes, laughing about his victims, and celebrating the supposed deaths of his wife and child. The most damaging recording had been made by Eleanor Robinson herself during one of their monthly phone calls. "Danny, I still light a candle for Alyssa and the baby every month. Mother, stop with the sentimental bullshit. I told you they were dead so you'd stop asking questions about why I threw them out. How can you talk about your wife and child that way? Because some people are burdens, Mother." Alyssa was weak, needy, pathetic, everything I needed to get rid of to build real wealth. The kid would probably have been just as useless. I did myself a favor getting rid of them. But they were your family. They were liabilities I couldn't afford. Family is a luxury for poor people, Mother. Rich people have assets and investments. When the recording ended, the courtroom was dead silent. Several jurors were openly crying. Even the court reporter had stopped typing to wipe her eyes. Dan's mother, Eleanor Robinson, took the stand as the prosecution's final witness. "Mrs. Robinson, you've known the defendant his entire life. In your opinion, is he capable of the crimes charged in this indictment?" Eleanor looked at her son with infinite sadness and spoke with quiet dignity. "The boy I raised died somewhere along the way to $38 billion. The man sitting at that table is capable of any cruelty if it serves his financial interests. Do you believe he abandoned his pregnant wife? I know he did. I know he celebrated when he thought she and the baby were dead. I know he called it cleaning house and getting rid of dead weight. Do you believe he's guilty of the financial crimes? I believe Daniel Robinson is guilty of every crime he's charged with, and probably many more that haven't been discovered yet. Money became his god, and he was willing to sacrifice anyone, including his own family, on that altar. The defense chose not to call Dan as a witness, a sure sign they knew he couldn't survive cross-examination about 12 years of recorded criminal admissions. Closing arguments were brief. The evidence spoke for itself with devastating clarity. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. When they returned, Foreman Patricia Williams stood to read the verdict that would determine Dan's fate. On the count of conspiracy to commit fraud, we find the defendant guilty. On the count of mail fraud, we find the defendant guilty. On the count of wire fraud, we find the defendant guilty. On the count of money laundering, we find the defendant guilty. On the count of tax evasion, we find the defendant guilty. Guilty, guilty, guilty. 27 separate federal felony convictions that would ensure Dan Robinson spent the rest of his life in federal prison. Dan sat motionless as his world officially ended, but his eyes never left Alyssa and David in the gallery. Judge Harrison scheduled sentencing for the following week, but everyone in the courtroom knew Dan would die behind bars. As court adjourned and federal marshals prepared to escort Dan back to jail, Alyssa gathered David in her arms and walked past the defendant's table for the last time. For just a moment, Dan and David's eyes met. The first and last time father and son would ever see each other as free people. "Mommy," David whispered, Why does the man look so sad? Because he made bad choices, sweetheart, and now he has to live with the consequences. I feel sorry for him. That's because you have a kind heart, baby. But sometimes people do things so bad that feeling sorry doesn't make it okay. As federal marshals led Dan away in shackles, David waved goodbye with the innocent friendliness of childhood. Bye, sad man. I hope you learn to make better choices. Even facing life in prison, surrounded by federal agents and reporters, Dan Robinson had been judged by his own 6-year-old son and found worthy only of a child's pity. And somehow that was the most devastating verdict of all. Justice had been served. The truth had been told. And David Turner Robinson would grow up knowing that actions have consequences, that powerful men aren't above the law, and that his mother had loved him enough to fight for what was right. The reckoning was complete. Chapter 10. The Final Confrontation. The greatest victory is not destroying your enemy. It's becoming so complete that they cease to exist in your world while you build something beautiful from the ashes of their cruelty. Daniel Robinson was sentenced to 65 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. At age 45, it was effectively 3 life sentences served consecutively. Judge Harrison's words echoed through the packed courtroom with the weight of final judgment. Mr. Robinson, you have shown a complete disregard for the law, for common decency, and for the basic humanity that should exist between people. Your crimes represent not just financial fraud, but a moral bankruptcy so complete it defies comprehension. You abandoned your pregnant wife, celebrated what you believed to be the deaths of your wife and child, and showed no remorse for the harm you inflicted on hundreds of thousands of innocent victims. This court sentences you to 65 years in federal prison, with restitution of $847 million to your victims, and permanent forfeiture of all assets connected to your criminal enterprise. Dan sat motionless as his life officially ended, but his eyes never left Alyssa and David, who sat in the front row surrounded by FBI agents and victim advocates. 2 years later, ADX Florence Federal Penitentiary. ADX Florence housed the worst criminals in America: terrorists, spies, mass murderers, and now one fallen billionaire. Dan's daily routine was brutal. Wake at 5 a.m., cold shower, processed food through a slot, 23 hours alone in an 80-square-foot concrete box. The physical torture was nothing compared to the psychological punishment that arrived through contraband magazines, showing him glimpses of the life he'd destroyed. Forbes featured Alyssa on their cover. Agent turned mogul. How Alyssa Turner built a $35 billion empire. People magazine showed photos of David at the Museum of Natural History. Caption reading, David Turner Robinson, 8, says his favorite thing is learning about science with his mom. Dan studied every photograph obsessively, memorizing his son's changing face, his growing confidence, the joy that spoke of a child raised with unconditional love. 3 years into his sentence. The wedding invitation arrived on David's 8th birthday, hand-delivered by an embarrassed guard. Alyssa Turner and Braxton Whitfield request the honor of your presence at their wedding ceremony. Inside was a handwritten note from David. Dear biological father, Mom said I could write about her wedding if I wanted to. She's marrying Uncle Braxton, who teaches me chess and how to fix things. Uncle Braxton asked if he could adopt me, and I said yes, because he's been like a real dad. I'm going to be David Whitfield now. I hope you're learning to be a better person in jail. Mom says some people can change if they really try. Your son, I guess, David. Dan read the letter 47 times before guards found him sobbing in his cell. His son had just given another man permission to become his legal father. 10 years into his sentence. The letter Dan wrote took months to perfect. "Dear David, your mother will probably never show you this letter, and she would be right not to. I don't deserve to be part of your life, but I want you to know that every day in this prison, I think about the father you deserved instead of the stranger whose DNA you carry. You don't need me. You have Braxton, who chose to love you when I was too broken to recognize what love meant. You have your mother, who is the strongest person I've ever known. I'm writing because I want you to know you are not me. The cruelty that destroyed my life is not inherited. You are good because you choose to be good. If you ever wonder about your biological father, know this. He existed once before I became what I became. He would have loved you more than life itself. Be better than us both. Someone who lost the right to sign this dad." Meanwhile, across the country, Alyssa found the letter in 15-year-old David's backpack months after it arrived. He'd kept it unopened, unsure what to do. "Do you want to read it?" she asked gently. David, now tall and handsome with his father's features, softened by his mother's kindness, considered carefully. "Will it hurt you if I do?" "Probably, but this isn't about me anymore." David read the letter twice, then looked up with tears in his eyes. "He's right about one thing. I'm not him." "No, sweetheart, you're better than both of us." "Are you still angry at him, Mom?" "Not the way I used to be. I'm sad for the man he could have been, and grateful every day for the life we built without him." "Do you think maybe someday I could write him back? Not to forgive him, but to tell him I turned out okay. I think that would be the most gracious thing anyone could do." David nodded thoughtfully. "I want to break the cycle, Mom. I want to choose healing over hatred." The final letter, David's 25th birthday. "Mr. Robinson, I received your letter from 10 years ago. Mom gave it to me for my 25th birthday, saying I was old enough to decide for myself. You were right. I am not you. Not because of genetics, but because every day of my life I've been surrounded by people who chose love over hate. I graduated from medical school last week. I'm specializing in pediatric oncology, helping children with cancer. I'm engaged to a wonderful woman who works with refugees. We want children someday, and we'll raise them with unconditional love. I forgive you not because you deserve it, but because forgiveness isn't about you. It's about me choosing not to carry your failures in my heart. You made your choices. I've made mine. David Whitfield. I kept Robinson as my middle name, not to honor you, but to remember how far love can take someone." Dan read the letter until his eyes could no longer see the words, until his heart could no longer bear the weight of his perfect defeat. His son, the child he had wanted dead, had become a doctor who would save other people's children. The boy he'd abandoned had grown into a man who chose healing over hatred. 23 years later, Daniel Robinson died in federal prison on a Tuesday morning in March. He was 68 years old. No one claimed his body. No obituary was written. David Whitfield, pediatric oncologist, husband, father of 2, learned of his biological father's death through a legal notification. He felt neither sadness nor satisfaction, only quiet relief. That evening, reading bedtime stories to his children, David whispered a prayer of gratitude for the woman who had taught him that love was stronger than hate, and that the best revenge against cruelty was creating something beautiful. Somewhere in the space between heaven and earth, Daniel Robinson finally understood what he had thrown away. But by then it was far too late to matter. Love had won. The cycle was broken, and David Whitfield would spend his life proving that healing was always stronger than hate. The end. In the end, the greatest victory wasn't destroying her enemy. It was raising a son who chose to heal the world, proving that love always wins.